Hello, and welcome back to the Save Ourselves podcast or SOP. This is episode 3, and I am your host, Aparna. And you might have already forgotten about the podcast because it's been a while since episode 2 came out, but without much of an explanation as to why the delays and everything, I think it's best to get right into episode 3 because it's gonna be an interesting one. So let's dive right in. So, in this week's episode, I want to dive into figuring out the Save Ourselves content strategy out loud on this podcast. Now, I have been actually planning to sit down with my notebook, my bullet journal, and I also spent some time on the Save Ourselves Notion page where I have some thoughts on my content strategy and some content plans already put down in a calendar. But I think I was not able to look at it very holistically. Either I would look at it on a much micro level where it would be focusing on like one topic at a time and then how to, sort of repurpose it across platforms, or I would be in a mono platform mindset where I would just think of, let's say, Instagram or just think of YouTube and how what kind of content I could make on there or what kind of strategy I needed to have in place. But with either of those alternatives, what was happening was that I was not able to form like a system that could give me like a holistic strategy and could also include all the platforms that the Save Ourselves is present on and I want to create content on. So whether it's simply like repurposing or announcing that some new content is up, or whether it's actually producing new content especially for that platform. Now, for example, what I'm trying here with this podcast episode is trying to turn it into a video podcast so that my viewers on YouTube can just have it on in the background and it's like talking to a friend while you grab a drink or a beverage or simply do any activity that you want to do and just have it on in the background. Or if you're listening to this on Spotify or any other podcast app, then it's something that you can just tune into as you go about your day. So this is also something that I wanted to figure out if I want to continue with the video podcast or just keep it plain audio or things like that. And because I have this whole figuring out bit to do, I was like, why don't I just take you guys along and figure it out along with you on this podcast episode? Because I know how much of a struggle it can be to actually come up with a content strategy altogether. And yeah, it is difficult. And in case there are any other content creators who are trying to figure it out, or if you're just interested in this sort of thing, I hope that this podcast episode helps. So let's start by looking at what kind of platforms Save Ourselves is on. And if you want to know sort of like the history or the timeline, I did a newsletter on this very topic last month where I broke down the timeline of when Save Ourselves started and how each platform was added one by one. So if you want to check it out, you can head over to the link in the description. I have a Substack for Save Ourselves. It's called the Save Ourselves Supplement. And there you can find the whole timeline. And yeah, now let's get into all the platforms that we have. So I have this notebook here and I have written down a few points that I sort of want to discuss or figure out. And do bear with me on this podcast episode because it's going to be a little bit rambly. I might digress. I might just, go off tangents here and there because I don't have a lot of things planned. I don't have a structure or an outline for this episode. I just have written down a few random points related to the strategy that I wanted to figure out myself. So it's going to be like a brainstorming session that I am documenting through this podcast. So I hope you get some like insight into the workings of my brain, and do forgive me if it's a little chaotic or all over the place. So now getting into all the platforms, Save Ourselves does have an Instagram. The handle is at Save Ourselves blog, and there I'm most active on stories where I'll post things about my day or what I'm doing related to Save Ourselves or just life updates sort of stuff. And then I also post reels or carousels or just images on and off. It's not the most active, but I've been trying to get back into creating content for that again. And so when it comes to Instagram, I feel like these are all different things that you need to look into. Like, you can't just say Instagram and have a strategy for that. You really need to look into reels as a separate format, carousels as a separate format, images, photos as a separate format, and also stories as a separate format. And so I really consider these like four different subsets of one platform. It's not like, let's say, newsletters, where I just have to show up and write a newsletter issue and just send it out. There's just one platform and one format that I need to think about. With Instagram, there are these different uh, typologies of content that need to be considered, in my opinion. So there's Instagram, which is like, I think, the largest or the most resistance I face when it comes to creating content, because there I think it's also a mix of creating original content, which is just for Instagram, like let's say a reel, or just like a photo dump, or some thoughts to share on my stories, or there are these polls or questionnaires that I'll usually put on my stories of like a mid-week or a mid-month reset or a new month reset or something like that. So there is this original content that needs to be figured out for Instagram, but then it's also a great medium to cross promote. So whenever I'll have a newsletter or a YouTube video or this podcast, I'll make sure that I put something out related to that, whether it's a shorter clip of it or some kind of content that's coming out from this content format, and then repurpose it for Instagram. So again, there are all of these sub things to figure out for Instagram, like different typologies. And the second part is original versus repurposing. The second platform, so I'm going to go in the order of, I don't even think there's an order, but let's tackle the content heavy or, effort heavy platforms first. So, yeah, I do believe that Instagram is an effort heavy platform. Even more so than that would, I think, be YouTube. So, YouTube requires the most intense amount of efforts in terms of hours, creativity, and in general, I think it's the most effort intensive platform. And but I also think that it has a directly proportional ROI to it. And for right now, for ROI, I mean in terms of views and engagement and everything, not monetary, since Save Ourselves isn't monetized yet. But in terms of YouTube, I think that's where I get the most bang for my buck in terms of my creativity, where I'll get that kind of response. For Instagram, I think the efforts are not always directly proportional to the uh, for each piece of content. Like, you could make a low effort reel which could get a lot of views without you having put like 5 to 10 minutes in that video, whereas something you put a lot of thought and effort into it could probably flop. But in terms of YouTube, I'd found that to be less of a scenario, and it's usually more or less proportional to the amount of efforts I'm going to put into that. And for YouTube, I feel like you need to have a solid strategy in mind, where you have like a content bank where you're putting down ideas as and when they come to you. And you're also, actively filming on the go. So for YouTube, I have this system of trying to film B-roll, which I can include here and there and I can repurpose that into multiple videos. And there's of course like sitting down in front of a camera, or what we call A-roll. And just like the act of sitting down and filming, and there's a lot that goes into it. You need to ensure that the lighting is good. Like, right now is the afternoon, and I think this would have been a little bit better had I shot it in the morning, but there was like a lot of construction and background noises happening, so this was the only time that I could really get to film. So that's like, there's a lot of like pre-production thought that goes into every YouTube video, and then there's the whole act of editing, which I think requires even more effort. So like, after like the editing and post-production stuff is even more effort intensive for YouTube, because there are a lot of things to figure out. You need to make sure that your edit is really catchy and engaging and the flow is proper. You're using good music, you're using good graphics, and these inserts or divisions in your video to keep like the pace of it going, and you want to retain your audience as much as is possible. So there are all of these things that you need to figure out for YouTube. So every video in itself has a lot of effort that goes into it, which is why I think it's important to have like a good content strategy for YouTube in place. Then the next thing, which is still new for me that I'm still figuring out, is this podcast. Now this is just the third episode, which means that I've just done like two full episodes prior to this, and a trailer episode, which was like a shorter one. But I did start this podcast out on a whim because I wanted like a new, more informal sort of outlet where it would be less production intensive. And even though there will be, now that I'm trying to shift to a video podcast or experimenting with it at least, there will be these editing processes, and just going through that video editing or audio editing process and then exporting the video and all of that with just an audio format. I think it's a little bit easier, but still I think compared to a YouTube video, podcast production is much easier. It's just that it's longer in terms of like the your podcast could run like for 30-45 minutes, it's fine, but then your YouTube videos could probably be around 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. But then since I am new to podcasting, I need to figure out how informal I want to be, what kind of strategy I want to have in place, and just sort of the differentiation. So I think for me, one of the most crucial factors is to figure out what kind of unique aspects I am bringing to my platform. So let's come back to this topic in a bit. Let's cover all the platforms first, and then we'll get into why we need to consider each platform. So I think Instagram, YouTube, and podcast are like the most effort intensive ones. The next in line is the newsletter. So the newsletter, even though it's usually, I'll write about 600 to 1,000 words depending on how I'm feeling that day or what kind of thoughts I am typing up. But then, since I am a writer, it comes pretty naturally to me, and it's like very therapeutic. It's a cathartic act, and to me it does not feel very effort intensive. It's, I think, the most natural form of creative outlet that I have. And while there is a certain degree of strategy that there should be in place, and I try to have in place, I think newsletters is something that comes out of me most organically, and it's something that clicks with me the most. Like that's the platform that I'm the most satisfied with in terms of the output. And like whenever I'm looking back on any of my newsletters, I'm really happy with what I've put out. In terms of, let's say, YouTube videos or Instagram, like, because my video and photo skills are not as good as my writing skills, I will have these scope for improvement that I can like pinpoint, or I'll be like, this could have been better, that could have been better. And while that's also true for newsletters, it's like the most creatively satisfying outlet that I have, since it's like my first language in terms of uh, format of content. So I think I wouldn't personally consider newsletter a pretty like effort intensive platform just because it comes that naturally. Then I think these are like the original or more effort or original content sort of platforms. Then we have the blog slash website. So earlier what I would do was I would put out a YouTube video, and I would also put out an accompanying blog post that would dive deeper into the topic, or it would have like a digital download file that you could use for like a for an exercise. If it's, let's say, a reflection sort of or a gratitude sort of a video, then it would be accompanied with like a worksheet on gratitude or journal prompts or something like that, and the blog would also go in much more detail. But now I've been questioning if I need the whole blog in place, because first of all, there's a lot of SEO and all of these optimization things that you need to look into when it comes to a blog. So if I do decide to get into it, it will be a pretty intensive effort, or if I don't give it the same thought that it needs to have in terms of these SEO and web optimization and all of that, then it would be more of a futile effort, is what I feel. So if I do want to get into it, I need to make sure that I have the bandwidth and the research in place before I dive in. But what I've been thinking lately is that I already do have newsletter as my primary written source of content. So do I really need to have a blog accompanying like podcast episodes or YouTube videos or something like that? Maybe what I can have just to have something out on the web related to that topic is like cross promotion sort of blogs where I have these links of the YouTube video or podcast or reel or something in the blog post, and then I just give these descriptions which are a bit SEO optimized. And yeah, so I think something like that. But then the blog is something that I'm very iffy about, and I haven't figured out if I really want to do anything about it. So it's blog slash website. So I use the Save Ourselves website to actually have updated, like to have all the content in one place, so that in case you want to see what's new on Save Ourselves this month or this week, you can just head over to the website and you'll find everything that's new recently. So you'll find the latest YouTube video, you'll find the latest blog post or newsletter or podcast episode and things like that. And just it's also like a refresher or an anchor to have everything in one place under one roof. And I think having that own having your own place on the internet, which is not uh, a part of any specific platform, is I think is something that's very important to me. So because while it's very highly like unlikely, what if YouTube shuts down tomorrow? What if Substack shuts down? What if Instagram shuts down? What if all these podcasting distributors shut down? All I'll have is my website where I'll still be able to put out something, and it won't be dependent on anything else. So I think having your own like little nook on the internet is pretty important, at least to me. And it's also where you find like information about Save Ourselves, as to why was it formed and how's the journey been, who am I and why am I doing this, and all of these sort of things also come into play. And yeah, so the other two platforms which I mainly use for cross promoting or just like announcement sort of things are LinkedIn and Threads. So I am after Twitter became X, I haven't really used it that much, and I'm not sure if I there is a Save Ourselves account on X, but I'm not sure if I really want to have it won't be much of an effort. Whatever I put on Threads, I can easily put out on X, but it's something just that I've just not like mentioned here. It's not a platform that I count for Save Ourselves. But then for LinkedIn and Threads, what I usually do is anytime a new type of content is out, I'll just use the link and like a brief description and post that as a way to gather like different or more eyeballs onto the piece of content. So that's, I think, um, so those two are, I think, the platforms that I'm looking at. And the last one, which isn't really active right now, is the Save Ourselves shop. So in case you're new and you've no idea what Save Ourselves has been doing for so long, apart from all the content that I usually post, I also have a shop that's active for some time during the year, like maybe during the period when the year changes around from like maybe November to February, depending on if I have new products to launch, it'll usually be active then. And I have been selling products which are helpful for productivity or planning, and just sort of in the self-help category, where I have had planners or calendar stickers which can be used as habit trackers, or like a book tracker where you can track every book that you have read, and it's like a physical or a digital copy, both of these options and things like that. So right now it's not active, but then depending on how the content strategy plays out and how the channels, like all of these different channels perform, I think it would be nice to have this occasional shop running in terms of digital downloads, which can be then made internationally available, or some sort of physical products which are more locally available or available maybe nationwide in India or something like that. And but then the shop is not really a big chunk of the content like strategy or just like thinking about right now. I think it's more of an afterthought that I'll have to, or it's something that I would need to think about down the line, and it doesn't really matter right now. What really matters are these main intense, like content intensive platforms, which is the newsletter, Instagram, YouTube, and podcast. So, yeah, okay. Now that we have covered all of these different platforms that Save Ourselves is present on, let's get into how I feel these platforms should relate, and how much cross or repurposing they really should have, or how much original stuff that they should have, and things like that. Because I'll tell you the questions that, or the doubts that I've been facing, and I just want to sort of voice them out loud and figure them, like think out loud and figure it out in this podcast, because that's the intent. Like, in case you are also trying to figure all of these things out for your own brand, for your own content, I hope that this will strike a chord with you, or maybe you have similar questions that you're tackling. So let's just figure it out together. So let's say I have this month in front of me. We're in July right now. So let's say I have to plan out my content for July. What I would ideally like to do is spread around all of these different platforms consistently enough that they keep popping up on your feed. Like, if it's a newsletter, it's consistent enough that you are reminded of it, let's say every week or every 2 weeks, that, oh, I think there's a Save Ourselves newsletter due, and now I'm eagerly waiting for it. Or similarly, in terms of the Instagram platform, or is there a new Save Ourselves story today, or is there a new reel that she's posted, or when's the next video coming? It's, I think, due now. It's another week, another Sunday, or something like that. So similarly for all of these platforms, but it also needs to be separated enough that the audience is not overwhelmed by it. So it would, I don't think anyone would really engage with the content if there's a newsletter and a podcast episode and a YouTube video and Instagram stories and reels coming at you consistently from this one single content brand. That would be like too much of content overload, and people would then disengage, or maybe just be very choosy. And of course, like, I'm very aware that my even though there's an overlap in my audience, there are unique audiences for each platform as well. So for example, there will be these core followers of Save Ourselves who will follow the brand across all of its platforms and engage in every single piece of content that I put out. So for those people, I need to ensure that there's some variety that I'm putting, and it's not the same copy pasted or repurposed into another format sort of content style that I'm giving it to them, because they obviously would be bored looking or listening to or reading the same topic, about the same topic, or maybe just like the transcribed version of it, or the video or audio version of it, 4 different times. So that would get pretty boring. It would also get a little annoying, and I understand that. However, I also need to ensure that for the unique audiences that I have for each platform, that they get to know about the same piece of content through these different platforms. So for example, if you're just listening to the podcast and you have no clue about the newsletter, there's someone else who's not listening to the podcast and just reads the newsletter, then I need to ensure that the effort that I'm putting into one piece of content is equally distributed and visible to my podcast listeners as well as my newsletter readers. So it's sort of like getting the bang for the buck, like I said, in terms of the content that I am, brainstorming and putting all of these efforts into. I also need to ensure that there is a little bit of repurposing, but it's not so much that the audience gets annoyed with it. And then there's also just this whole figuring out of how to lay my content across the month so that the frequency is also enough to keep you, eager and looking forward to the new pieces that are coming out, but also not to make you feel overwhelmed. And for that, one of the things, so this is like the posting frequency that I have been like noodling around with, and let me know your thoughts on this, like if it would be too much content or if it sounds about right. So what I've been thinking is that I post one YouTube video in the first week, then in the second week is the podcast episode, because then I would be able to turn it into a video podcast, so it automatically like goes on, it's distributed on YouTube. So technically YouTube has an upload every week, and then the podcast also comes out on Spotify at the moment, I think. And then then the next week it would be a YouTube video again. So then it's like alternate weeks of YouTube videos and alternate weeks of the podcast. So like I said, technically YouTube does get an upload every single week, but the content is completely different. All of the topics are different. So it's like getting four new pieces of content every single week. And the newsletter, because I feel like the newsletter and the podcast episode, or the newsletter and the YouTube video, should have this linkage somewhere in between, because the newsletter does turn out to be more of an informal behind the scenes, or the process or approach sort of the version of the podcast episode or of the YouTube video. So I think essentially what I would do is take the topic and then distribute it and then allocate the video platform for it. For example, if it's like a rambly topic like figuring out my content strategy, then I think a podcast is much better, because the audience does want to know like what is the thought behind your strategy and what are you trying to do exactly. But if it's something like how I maintain my gratitude log over the last, how I've been maintaining my gratitude log for over 2 years now, then I think it can be a succinct video where it's just like 5 to 10 minutes, and I can make it a more visual. It does need a lot of visual aids or tips and things like that, which can be shot in like a crisp 10-minute YouTube video. So then, based on the topic, I think it's best to allocate it to the platform that's relevant. And then the newsletter is what takes a deep dive into that topic. And so, just what I've been thinking about is, do I produce like a fortnightly newsletter that covers maybe two topics at a time and gives you like much more meaty or like packed newsletter, or do I do it each week where it is paired with the individual video slash podcast, and then you sort of get to correlate the video and the newsletter and see like the front end and the back end and things like that. But then would sending out one newsletter every single week, would that be too much? I'm really not sure. I think it wouldn't be, but that's something that I need to figure out, because this is not the end of the content. Like if this already feels too much, there's also Instagram that I need to think about. And no matter the platform, I think one of the most important things is consistency. And it's not just for growing on the platform or whatever, it's also to keep me in the habit of creating for that platform, or keep my like flow going. I need to have that momentum, and that momentum is only built through consistency. So okay, let's say it's week 1, we have a YouTube video and we have an accompanying newsletter. All of these also need to be cross promoted on Instagram. So ideally I would be posting 3 times a week on Instagram, and the division for that I was thinking was probably like 1 or 2 reels, and then slash 1 or 2 like carousel or photo based posts. And then there's also this linkage between the other platforms. So for example, if I have this YouTube video that I'm putting out this week, one of the Instagram posts needs to talk about it so that the Instagram audience can be directed to the YouTube video, and vice versa. If I'm putting out a newsletter, the same thing needs to happen there, where the newsletter can be sort of, condensed into a carousel post, and then that audience is then redirected to the newsletter, and the newsletter audience is also told to like check out the Instagram page. And then the remaining, the third post can just be like an original content that is just being made as like a short form reel or some sort of content just for Instagram. Like, it does not have to necessarily cross promote or be directed to some other platform every single time. So yeah, I think this is what I've been thinking about in terms of my strategy. And it does feel like a lot of content to be made, honestly. I think it's no wonder that a lot of creators are pursuing this as a full-time job and then managing to, pump out this much of content. But I think it's also doable. Like, I've seen a lot of people do this along with their full-time jobs, and they just sort of, manage it. And earlier I have managed it, like in during the pandemic, even during like college, or in the beginning when I had my full time job, I used to manage like uploading one YouTube video every single week along with 3 Instagram posts. So now it's essentially going to be like the same amount, where it would be like one video or one podcast episode every week along with 3 Instagram posts, and then the additional thing would be the newsletter. So yeah, I think that's what I'm aiming for. So if you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, I want you to hold me accountable to this sort of frequency of posting, where it would be one video slash one podcast per week, one newsletter per week, and then 3 Instagram posts per week. So this is the amount of content that I am aiming for, and I hope to, put out, because then this would ensure that I show up on all of these platforms on a very consistent basis, that I'm able to form a disciplined system where I, document my life, where I practice that creativity muscle, and when I create content in all of these different formats. Now, I think let's talk a little bit about the challenges that might come, because I've been not creating content for such a long time now that, first of all, the challenge would be getting into the rhythm of things slowly but surely. And even then, let's say that's like a starting off challenge. The engine needs to warm up, and once it is, it'll get much easier. Of that, I'm aware. But the challenges are also like juggling your actual life with all of this. Life is never like, monotonous. It always has these chapters and things keep on changing. So the content strategy here, while it needs to have this structure that I just mentioned of all of these posts or frequency that I am committing to, it also needs to be flexible enough where it can let me adapt, or where it can be in tune with the changing life seasons or periods that I might have in my own life. So there is that sort of flexibility and adaptability that I need to calculate or figure out into this. And along with that, I think the challenge is to also sort of switch from one content format to the other. So if one week I'm focusing on a YouTube video, it needs a different approach or a lens as to the podcast episode that's coming out the next week. Or it'll need a different sort of perspective from the newsletter that I need to write for the same topic, or like a adjacent or a complementary topic, for example. And it also needs like a whole different set of skills or eye when it comes to converting this topic into a format suitable for Instagram. So I think this change of perspective, or this shift that I need to do, this creative switching that's needed, that is also like a challenge. But I think it's an exciting challenge that I am looking forward to. The earlier ones that I mentioned are more like hindrances or obstacles that I'll have to work around or figure out for myself. So I think that is the strategy that I wanted to figure out loud. I think I had the jigsaw puzzle pieces in mind. It's just that I hadn't put them together. And now through this podcast, I have put together a strategy. And more than a strategy, I think it's my content posting plan. For the actual strategy, I will have to sort of, dive into the sort of topics or content buckets or the areas that I can focus on when it comes to creating content. But I think I'll save that either for another episode or just keep it private so that I'm not giving away too much and you have a reason to come back for more. And but if I do feel like it, if you want to, hear about what kind of how do I plan out my topics or where do I get my ideas from or something like that, feel free to leave a comment or just get in touch and let me know that this is something you would like to see. I'd be more than happy to make more episodes related to this and just figuring out or like taking you backstage for Save Ourselves and show you how things work here or how I plan and just get this content engine running. So, yeah, this I think is my content strategy where I want to post consistently on all of these platforms and have this separation yet consistency in mind. And hopefully it works out and I'll get going right away. I now need to go and edit this podcast episode and have it uploaded for you to be able to see it. So, hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll be back again very soon. Let's hope that I don't take these longer breaks anymore, and I'll be back. There are all of the links to all of my other platforms in the description to wherever you're listening. So, feel free to go check those out, and I'll be back soon. I hope you have a nice day. Bye bye.